Well, good afternoon from Stoke-on-Trent. My name is Chris Calkin, and it's my pleasure to chair this afternoon's session. If, like me, this is your first webinar, fear not, we have Guy Mitson from HFMA to see us safely through. This is the first of a trilogy of linked webinars designed to address efficiency and productivity, looking at the challenge and opportunities, staff engagement and patient safety. There could be no better time to consider the headline topic, delivering more with less. We are all grappling exactly with that challenge as we enter the new financial year. Although if you haven't got your plans in place now, you might be wondering if they're actually going to deliver by the end of the year. Just a few housekeeping points. We are recording the webinar, and the slides and a recording will be available on the HFMA website from Monday. You have two audio options. One uses your PC or laptop speaker, and the other your telephone. There is in the chat box, anybody who's having difficulty hearing me, some helpful instructions. There will be time for questions at the end of the presentation. Please type your questions into the area as they occur to you. I shall try and group the questions so we get maximum coverage of the areas of interest. Can I now introduce our speaker for this afternoon, Jim Easton. Jim is NHS Director for Improvement and Efficiency. Jim has worked across most levels of the NHS and is therefore uniquely placed to talk about some of the practicalities of delivering the QIPP agenda. Jim, by this miracle of technology, can I invite you to give your presentation?
Chris, thanks very much indeed, and good afternoon to everyone. It's a real pleasure. I'm hoping that you can see the slides I'm showing you by this webinar technology. No doubt someone will let me know if there's a problem. Meanwhile, I'm just going to press on. It's a great time with 2 days to go really till the new year starts, the first year where we move from an era of what I'm sure we'll look back on as kind of unparalleled plenty to one where we face, I think factually correctly saying the most difficult period of funding the NHS has ever had. And so what I thought I'd do is sort of take stock with you fairly honestly about where I think the QIPP work has got to across the country, good and bad, and where I'm thinking about focusing my attention over the coming period. I'm sure I'm going to leave plenty of time for some Q&A at the end, and I've asked Chris to make sure we've got no holds barred on that. So please, apart from any personal abuse, please don't hesitate to raise the real and substantial challenges and issues that you're facing. So it's quite remarkable, really. It's a couple of years ago that David Nicholson sort of set out this forward look of what the NHS was going to be facing, and it's turned out to be remarkably prescient. He's, I think, still the only public service leader to have upfront quantified the challenge that was facing this part of the public service. And I think perhaps it wasn't just prescient. Perhaps by talking about it as much, we've kind of created the future that we're experiencing. I mean, it is this paradoxical situation, this paradox which is particularly difficult to explain to the public and many of our staff, and actually to senior, trust me, to senior politicians as well, that we are simultaneously experiencing a very generous settlement by the standards of the rest of the public sector. No doubt true, and many of you will be dealing, for example, with the impact on local authorities and social services, and that's an even more robust environment, notwithstanding the money from the NHS settlement that's gone in. Paradoxically, it's a comparatively generous settlement, but as I say, represents the most difficult extended period of funding that the NHS has ever faced. In my 24-year career, I can remember the odd year when things got difficult, but not a forward look for at least the next 3 years. And most informed commentators would say some form of relative scarcity beyond that as well. You'll be aware there's an argument going on, a debate at the technical level, which is not unimportant, about the extent to which the settlement we've had still represents real terms growth, given the inflation forecast and therefore the impact on the GDP deflator. I mean, in one sense, that's a technical argument and a political argument, but there is no doubt that effectively, whichever side of that you fall, pretty much NHS spending is staying flat over the coming period. And as time goes on and we face the pressures of demographic growth and new technologies, this counterfactual gap of around 20 billion opens up. If we don't tackle this problem, we will be in deficit by something around 20 billion over the next 3 to 4 years, and clearly long before that we would be deep in trouble. So it's been good for us to sort of set this out and get a run at it, but it bites now. It's about to start hitting us in a very real way. When we thought about the response, these are the kind of 4 headings that we used, and I think it's a legitimate question. Why bother having any kind of organised response at all? And QIPP is a particularly kind of silly acronym. And I think the reason was, or rather I'm certain the reason was, that in one sense it wouldn't have been that difficult just to drive the efficiency to save money. I mean, I've been in periods in my career before, and I'm sure everyone on the call has, where money is tight and you just stop doing things. And certainly in the late 80s and early 90s, when money was tight, we would let waiting times run out and let quality drift out. But we've made such substantial gains in terms of NHS performance over recent years that there was, at the level of colleagues like David Nicholson, an absolute determination that even in the face of this problem, we should set our stall out not to simply return to those days to allow quality to worsen. So we made this counterintuitive commitment, which is that we were going to try and drive the efficiency gains we needed significantly by driving quality up. It's a brave thing to say. We, of course, collected and published the evidence on the NHS evidence website about whether that's feasible. Is it a credible thing to say? And that evidence base, much of which I'll touch on later in this brief talk, says, yeah, there are plenty of things you can do to drive efficiency and quality together. The question is really, can you do it at scale? Can you do it at the pace required? And because that was the question, we've been trying to work with the service to create a program that tries to have some chance of responding to this challenge. With these 4 components: engagement, resetting the whole of the kind of planning and delivery system for QIPP, thinking about how we change national levers and those things we do control nationally, and what support do we need to provide for those of you on the call who are in the muck and bullets of trying to deliver really difficult, complex change locally. And I'm going to spend most of the rest of the time talking about these 4 components. On a call with, I guess, largely finance colleagues, I mean, perhaps people wouldn't expect you in their stereotypes to be interested in engagement, but those finance directors I've talked to are absolutely committed to knowing that unless we get people kind of believing that this is important and can be done, then we've got no chance just through our control mechanisms of doing this in a way that sustains quality. And so we've been out on the road, as I know many of you had, in a really intensive way, probably bigger than anything we've done before, trying to drive understanding of what this problem is, both within the service and in the media, and what we need to do to respond. And I guess this is my summary of kind of where we are. Well, on the good side, there's actually a really high recognition of kind of the fact that there is a challenge facing the NHS, both inside the service and the media. It's not by accident that if you pick up an informed newspaper and it's talking about the wider issue of public spending or the NHS, it doesn't simply say, oh, well, the NHS is protected, so that's okay. It will talk about the £20 billion efficiency challenge. So we've managed together to sort of locate that in the public's mind, however, which is a huge achievement, and I think the same is broadly true in the service as well. But of course, quite what that means is complicated. This paradox of, is it protected or is it bad, plays out for me every day. People saying, well, are we making cuts or are we reinvesting the money we save? The language is quite problematic. The Secretary of State would like to talk about every penny being reinvested. Well, it's true that we're not removing money from the service, but reinvestment creates an idea that there's going to be lots of many new things happening, which perhaps is also not an accurate description. So it's difficult to get beyond the headline of a £20 billion efficiency challenge, getting the language right in a way that really engages with frontline doctors, nurses, and actually frontline managers as well, and the public is complicated. Our research also shows us that although there's this general broad understanding, that understanding isn't always deep or detailed. So you, I'm sure, could point me towards hundreds of staff, sort of people I meet, good committed colleagues who still believe that this is an agenda of cuts, or that it's going to go away, or don't really kind of follow through what it means for them and their services. And I think probably the limitation of the engagement program that we're experiencing most profoundly now is that whilst we got, I think, a huge amount of buy-in from individuals and stakeholders that the problem should be tackled and that the game plan was the correct game plan, all that is in principle. In other words, is it a good thing to treat more patients out of hospital? Virtually, I think every commentator has said, in principle, yes, it is. But when it's your hospital, your ward, your services, your specialist nurses who are affected, then of course that's challenged. And I think where most people are in implementation is in moving from the ideas of what they want to change to the reality, and are experiencing, as you'd expect, and as we always do in these change programs, much more anxiety and perhaps even resistance to what it is that we actually need to do. And I'm sure you'll want to raise questions about the challenges of when we have to do reconfiguration issues or staffing issues, just what that means too. Slightly Delphic last incomplete bullet point from me there, moving on from engagement 2. We're trying to move on to the next stage of the engagement program, to building through kind of campaigning means electronically large numbers of relatively frontline people who are committed to change, to draw them together to act as the messengers for what we need to do next. I'm just going to say no more about that, except that if there are any of you who are interested in being part of trying to create a movement about saving the NHS through delivering these things, then we'd be delighted to get you engaged in that work. So the engagement program actually externally evaluated recently and was regarded as an exemplar of the work that's been done throughout the service, mostly by you. But I think we should be cautious, as I have been in that slides, about the limitations that certainly brings. The second thing we did, if you remember those 4 things, was we've really, in a pretty, frankly, a pretty top-down way, we've changed the kind of the planning system to gear it to QIPP. Most obviously, the operating framework, which David Flory leads. David and I work on that in the sense of seeing that as a document really designed to enshrine QIPP in the way the system works, and the difficult judgments we've taken about where to set efficiency in tariff and where to modify payment systems and so on have really been driven by the calculations we're making about the kind of change we needed in QIPP. But across the country, particularly at PCTs, if you work in a PCT, you'll be cursing me about a pretty intrusive top-down process to get people resetting and working through their local plans about how they are delivering QIPP. Everybody has a plan. I'll say some more about the issues within them, but you know, across the country in a way that people sometimes found too top-down, and I kind of make no apology for, because I think we needed to sort of change the system, inject some change of direction in the system. There is a process in train. As you know, we thought there was a danger emerging that there'd be a separation between QIPP as a kind of medium-term or change stuff and in-year financial and performance delivery. One of the things that David Flory and I have been seeking to do over the last 4 or 5 months in particular is to bring together into one process the powerful, well-established finance and performance processes with the kind of medium-term and wider change QIPP processes. Now, there are still some lumpy edges around there, still some bits that don't quite fit, but we're encouraging ourselves, and I would encourage you, that we can't simply have a series of one-year slices to deliver QIPP. This is, we know the way the loading of activity goes, the phasing, that we need to be working now intensively on the issues that will start to deliver in 2013, 2014, at the same time as you are delivering your organizational quality and cost improvement programs internally for this year. It's not a choice between the two. And so however you do it, we think it's important to continue to strongly integrate those arrangements. Now, it's no surprise that when you think about the different starting positions people have and the issues they're facing, that when we look out at the plans, we see quite wide variation. I'll just flick forward to this slide, which I've and taken all the names of the guilty parties off. But this was a selection of plans that we were just trying to make sense of in a part of the country. And you know, as you move to the right, we think the plan is better. As you move up, we think we've got confidence in the delivery, often based on our historical confidence. And you'll see virtually the full spectrum. Areas who look, not the majority, but areas who look in a strong place, know what they're doing, have a good track record of delivery and are getting on with it. People in the middle, either moving forward in the right direction but with some risk, or interestingly people who look as though they're getting on with it but don't like the planning process, with which I sympathise, but there we go. And people with some significant deep issues where it's difficult both to get the plan right and in a good place and to yet be confident together that we've got quality of delivery. We shouldn't really be surprised by that distribution now. It's something we'd recognise. If you looked at issues that we were more familiar with managing, waiting times or financial performance, we'd see much more movement to the right. People have got much more used to managing those issues. It's kind of a reflection of the new environment and skill set. So it's not a surprise, but of course, given the pressure on us, it requires intensive work to help colleagues move to the right and upwards in that distribution. Yeah, there is, of course, geographical variation as well, and I'm someone whose much of career was in the north of England and more latterly have worked in the south. Although this isn't completely linear, it's true to say that the problem tends to be more fierce the further south you go, related both to funding and to structural issues. In fact, if you look at some of the QIPP plans where the northeast needs to get to, for example, in terms of beds per population, and I'm ignoring for the moment the important issue of levels of ill health. I know I shouldn't, but where they need to get to is where the south starts. So there are some significant differences, and I think the challenge will play out somewhat differently across the country. We have final plans now, and we're busy working through the assessment of those, and we're working with the service to point people in the direction of good ideas, to provide support and some pressure, I guess, on areas where there are still problems, and to understand where there are difficult structural issues which may need broader solutions. I'll make reference once or twice through this presentation to the fact that, of course, in addition to facing the QIPP challenge, described by one of the major consultancies as the largest challenge facing any healthcare system anywhere in the world, we are also at the same time, since the election of the coalition government, also embarking on a huge program of changing the NHS. Many commentators have offered a view on whether doing those two things together is a helpful thing to do. From my point of view, there's no doubt that some of the organisational change in the short term is disruptive to a smooth process of planning. On the other hand, if you look at one of the fundamental issues in everybody's QIPP plan, which is changing the pattern of demand, bringing GP leaders into making that happen has been underplayed today and could be hugely advantaged by GP commissioning. So for me, it's a bit of a two-edged sword, but we are having to take some decisions to try and deal with that. The most important one, and also quite controversial, which I've been leading over recent weeks, is grouping together PCT management into because we felt that PCT management teams were unlikely to be sustainable safely through the period, creating clusters of those, and we'll be working with those clusters to move QIPP planning and oversight of delivery and to them, so we've got some sense of continuity. I mentioned the point that planning to delivery is difficult, but it is what we are now expecting people to do. The overriding issue for people now is not to keep reworking their plans, but to get on with those elements of delivery. Most QIPP plans also require good working across systems. Many of the efficiencies that the game plan identified are kind of inter-organizational efficiencies. They're what happens between primary and secondary care, or between secondary and community, or between our system and social care. There's huge variability in terms of relationships and capability to make that happen. And again, I think that's an area of attention. We've also really found it difficult at any level, nationally, regionally, locally, to properly triangulate money activity and workforce. Money and activity much better than it ever was, and I think we've made further progress through this process. But turning that into reliable, accurate numbers of what we think is going to happen with the workforce is very difficult, not least, of course, because the workforce largely belongs to providers, who many of whom are rightly independent. I remember being an FT chief executive and certainly regarding my workforce as my business, but also interestingly because it turns out that when we look at developing models for out-of-hospital care and the evidence base for that in this country or internationally, that evidence base is extremely weak on what it means for how staff change, how many, when we move patients with chronic disease from acute care to being cared for out in the community, how many staff, nurses, doctors, physios, of what kind need to come out of one service and move into the other. We're doing some urgent detailed work with the Centre for Workforce Intelligence to try and populate that. And if you've got a fantastic model on this call, please make it your business to let us know. But in general, it's shown to be a significant weakness. It's also quite a difficult political issue for me at the moment around changes in the workforce. Our view continues, of course, to be that there will be a reduction in workforce, and even with the swinging cuts we're making in administration costs, that doesn't quite cut it, and there will need to be also changes in the clinical workforce. But you can imagine that that's a politically very, very sensitive issue that we're trying to work our way through right now. So I've talked about two things: the engagement program and kind of resetting the planning system. The third of the four things we've tried to do is to kind of line up the national policy levers we control to try and achieve the kind of broad elements of the game plan. So on the left, you'll recognise some of the things that you have said to us that need to happen to deliver this QIPP agenda, and we're trying through tools like the operating framework to make that happen. So let me give you some examples. Well, we instituted a pay freeze, and as you know, have also set off on a course of some pretty drastic management administration cost reductions. Painful stuff, but it actually has bought quite a lot of space and time in the early days of the QIPP model. It probably gave us an extra 9 months to a year in terms of delivery overall, and bought a little bit of space for people to start work on the longer term issues. Any of you who've heard me speak on platforms before will have known that I personally wanted to go much further and was a big advocate of further pay restraint, particularly around incremental drift, and we put a huge amount of effort into seeking to agree a national deal with trade union colleagues to also freeze the kind of annual uplift in the Agenda for Change pay structure, which failed to reach agreement. Great disappointment to me, and I know although we've left the door open for people to do that locally, I'm under no illusions how difficult that is, and that many colleagues feel that's kind of the worst of all worlds. David Flory on the HSJ last week talking about that pay bill control in an industry like ours remains a pivotal issue in success going forwards, and so for whichever means we need to find ways of doing it. I have to say I think there are also important things in the terms and conditions where perhaps in retrospect, certainly to my eyes with my job, some of the things about the way we pay people, the rates we pay people for sickness when they were previously booked to do an out-of-hours shift, or in general the cost of out-of-hours work, look to me like issues that we need to get into some pretty difficult and urgent dialogue with trade union colleagues on. On the primary care side, we're also in this big process of seeking to agree the new GP contract, where the QIPP deliverables are front and centre of how we're trying to frame that. Those of you in primarily in hospital businesses will be feeling this second point on this slide very strongly, which is the pressure in tariffs. I mean, there was a lot of careful thought about precisely where to try and land the level of efficiency in tariff in a way that drove change but didn't drive people over the edge. Now, in fact, you hear all sorts of different stories. Certainly the Foundation Trust Network has made a vociferous case that we've been too hard. Again, I see a lot of variability as the tariff plays out in different places. between those people who seem to be doing slightly less than the 4% efficiency that we thought was necessary, to a number, particularly those with some deep structural problems who are having to do something up to twice that, which is very difficult. So then I accept that there may be issues about the absolute level of efficiency requirement, but I think it's at least as much for me a move from a period in which we were delivering nominal efficiency in a period of growth. I mean, there is a world of difference between delivering an assumed tariff efficiency gain in a period where there's 6% growth in the money going into the system, to one where you're driving an efficiency gain against relatively completely flat, virtually flat funding. And I think I'm not wishing to minimise the experience of providers at the moment. I remember, as I say, being one, but I certainly think that part of this is just how big a change it is from the previous kind of business models inside those organisations, which were often built on growth and having money around to oil the wheels of change. I think that as we kind of grind down on this business model of rewarding an organisation for just admitting more and more patients, I think it would be a legitimate criticism that if we're trying to make that a less attractive business model, we need to do more quickly on alternative tariff systems, and we're certainly taking that up very seriously and looking at year of care or capitation-based models. We think it's probably impossible for those to be set in a correct way completely from the centre. Already, if you just set a price for, a hip replacement from the centre, it plays out very differentially across the country. If you try to set a price for a year of care for diabetes from the centre with all the data issues in there, I'm sure we would get it wrong in virtually every place. So it may be that we're trying to develop a framework which needs to be populated and developed more locally. I mean, I've been working very hard on trying to get political understanding and support for the change. It's held together reasonably well so far. I think we're about to enter the period where that's most tested and real stuff starts to happen about changing the number of jobs or configuration issues, and I'm sure there'll be some significant tests coming locally and nationally about that change. And finally, we've been trying to make links with what I still think of as the Andrew Lansley reform package, but I think in a sort of an echo of things we've known before, we're now describing as NHS modernisation. So we are trying, as I know you are locally, to get engagement with GP commissioning groups on getting them linked to QIPP plans, adding value, particularly on the referrals, and trying to build their ownership for the future. I've talked about the creation of clusters and how that's important to us and how we're going to use that through the next year or two as the kind of basis for trying to manage QIPP delivery as SHAs come off the pitch, and working with colleagues on the provider arm here, so those organisations in the FT pipeline where they have to produce their integrated business plan, their forward look, their agreement on how they're going to become FTs, that will be completely consistent with the QIPP plan locally, so not a separate process or one in which issues are fudged between one or other of those. And finally, in our game plan, because when we looked at what people wanted to do in delivery of their QIPP plans, there were a whole series of issues across the country that were completely common. As you know, we've been trying to organise, as have regions, programs of support for people. Now, let me start by saying I don't care whether people at a local level want to be involved in the national work or long-term conditions or not. I mean, I'd like you to want to do it, but it's up to you. This is not us trying to enforce on a more decentralised system, sort of top-down change. What I would say to people is this, which is anyone who thinks that they can find all the solutions in their own organisational boundary in the time available is, I think, deluding themselves. And so whether or not you want to work with us, I would encourage everybody to be thinking, how do we accelerate the change process we've got by working with others, by shortcutting the learning, by delivering things at scale and at pace. And I still meet trusts who basically believe they're going to achieve all this themselves, and I'm pretty sceptical. The sort of things I'm going to do a very, very brief run through these and sort of what we've done to date, and it's a mixed bag. I'm really proud of some of the early work we've done in a number of these. In others, it's been much more difficult to get traction. And we will only carry on with the work that we think adds value to local people delivering. Safe Care, we've got a piece of work which Maxine Power leads on the relationship between safety and cost and which safety issues you would drive to make a cost reduction. In fact, the numbers don't suggest that safety is a huge financial contributor. I rather hoped it was going to offer up more than it is. It's a small number of hundreds of millions, not the billions. But it's obviously a critical issue of itself and worth doing. And the business case for investing in DVT reduction, using ultrasound blood flow monitors in theatre, falls prevention, is a real business case. It's not an artificial one. It delivers obviously an improvement in the quality of experience for patients, but also a genuine return on investment within a relatively short period. The work we've been doing on right care really has two main themes now. One is trying to make sense of low-value procedures, which turns out to be an extraordinarily confused picture across the country, which we're trying, in advance of the commissioning board coming into operation, to put into some shape. And secondly, some important work that I think would be very important being led for us by East of England on supporting patients to make better decisions themselves about the treatments they want. Really clear evidence that when patients are supported to think properly about the evidence of whether they should have their knee replaced or have other kinds of significant interventions, they largely make more conservative decisions, and they're the right thing for those patients and for, as it happens, the NHS spending account as well. Long-term conditions, John Oldham, one of the great kind of leaders of clinical change in the NHS, who led all the changes in primary care through the period of the Blair government, working to create and spread actively models of long-term condition care across the country. Long-term condition is a great example. Everybody agrees that, pretty much everybody agrees, that one of the solutions to affordability in our healthcare system is not hospitalizing the large numbers of people we do with COPD, heart failure, diabetes, that we have models that show how that can be done, but we just don't implement them at scale and at pace coherently. And John is working with teams from across the country to spread that practice and put it in place. And it's one of the areas I really encourage you to think about joining up. On urgent care, big focus for us on there is on 111 and trying to make sense of a better front end for emergency care. When you do the 111 thing and create the number, you have to, behind that, create a pattern of services that's much more organized and integrated. It was a bit of a shock to me looking at what, through good intention, we had created, not least me, through the last 10 years, in terms of new arrangements for GP out of hours, urgent care centres, changes to A&E. We've created an ever more sort of fragmented set of entry points into the system. And the 111 process, in addition to creating a number for people to dial, forces you to begin to sort that out. And end-of-life care, again, not a huge sum, but one in which the business case for doing things better for patients and in a more cost-effective way is really strong. And it's, of course, one of the benchmarks of whether there is a queue in QIPP at all. On the provider side, Tony Spotswood did a fantastic piece of work for us on back-office efficiency. Many provider chief execs and DOFs that I met before we did this work were sceptical that there was much money in back office. In fact, Tony upped the estimate as he did the work. And being slightly harsh here, it's one of these issues where our interests and our parochial interests dominate doing the right thing in terms of efficiency. So the evidence is absolutely clear that joining together finance and HR and other support systems allows you to probably have a better service and be much more cost effective. But because of our interest in our own needs and our own organisations, we still find it hard to do. So anyone who hasn't read the back office report and hasn't yet seen how to get engaged in the kind of exemplar work that Tony is leading, I strongly encourage you to do it. On procurement, I spent a happy couple of hours at the Public Accounts Committee trying to explain what we were doing on hospital efficiency, on which the issue of procurement came up. It's very complicated in terms of all our attempts to create scale, and where your interest about local buying may or may not outweigh the benefits to be got from scale. It's a complicated thing, but all the evidence continues to suggest that in aggregate terms we continue to be taken for a ride by the industry and to buy in efficiently. We're a poor customer, and however you're doing it, again, I say you need to get into some kind of mechanism at scale to deliver gains in procurement. On pathology, we've reached a position where we've got a number of parts of the country, some in London, East of England and so on, who are really going now to try and rationalise the amount of pathology real estate. In other parts of the country there remains significant clinical and managerial and practical resistance to it. The evidence remains clear that we are in a paradoxical position of supporting far too much pathology, real estate and capital expenditure and preventing us having the best equipment and the best results possible, and we have to kind of get over our organisational boundaries, and we're looking at how we can use the contractual and standards levers to help drive that. And medicine's use, the drug bill remains a huge issue in this, and we are, under Peter Rowe's leadership, doing a significant amount of work both to kind of exemplify and support local change, but also take on some national issues in terms of pricing and accessing medicine. And we're continuing to do work on primary care contracting. I talked about the contract with Mo to try and set that nationally. And let me finish by just on this list by just mentioning technology. One of the things I did when I took this job up was I went out to leaders of other industries and asked them how they grapple with the issue of driving better quality and better value, and they all talked relentlessly about one thing, which is technology. We seem to be an industry, and this isn't just an NHS problem. I see it internationally in healthcare, who has a unique view on technology, which is that it adds to quality but also adds to cost. We find it very hard to see the application of really great technologies as one which drives cost there. And I do see that changing. You know, I see the airline staff checking desks in some outpatient clinics, and I see people taking a different view about the way they harness medical equipment to drive value. But overall, it remains a problem. Our chief executives and people like me don't wake up every night in the middle of the night wondering what our competitors are doing and how we need to use technology to drive that change. But I think leaders in other industries do. So one of the things we want to do is build a sort of cultural change and a training change through our leadership programs about how we harness technology to drive value. There are still NHS leaders who regard it as a badge of pride that they can't switch their computer on. There is, we have to get people who are massively empowered and thinking about driving the efficiency gains that exist and quality gains that exist in technology. So what next? What's my final slide? Well, I think we're at a pivotal moment. We've done some planning, we've made some progress with some early kind of pay restraint, but it's about to get very real very quickly, and this is going to be a tough and turbulent time. I guess overall, given the financial headroom that the overall NHS has built up, you would say there ought to be enough money in the bank for the year to come. That doesn't play out evenly, but if we don't start changing the kind of cost base underneath that, then that money will begin to run out. So this is the year where delivery on our plans is essential. There's an issue for me as well about discriminating between cuts and QIPP delivery. Now, I fully understand that in a provider organisation you need a good cost improvement programme as well as linked with your QIPP programme. You need to kind of be having good housekeeping on savings measures. But there are organisations, local systems, where it seems that people have kind of lost the cue in QIPP, where they're just driving things to hit a financial bottom line. I'm determined to try and defend people, for example, if they're losing clinical staff, if what they're doing is doing that off the back of a productive series program or a redesign across their health community that shows as patients move, we also can take the opportunity to reduce the number of clinical staff. That's something we need to get in behind you and defend at every level. But just taking a red line to the staffing levels on a ward is not the same as that. The first of those is QIPP, the second one isn't. In fact, the second one takes you dangerously towards the territory that mid-staffs got into in just trying to solve the problem in a financial way. And anyone who isn't looking at the kind of evidence that's being put into the Francis 2 report on mid-staffs and is busy just cutting costs without thinking about the impact on quality is in a dangerous place. And we'll be, through the National Quality Board, trying to get out some kind of support and tools for making sure that as you take the necessary financial action, you're also asking the right questions about what is the impact on quality. We know that many of your plans that we've seen, require service changes to the workforce, moving things around between places, and configuration issues. And the politics on that is always difficult and will be hot. And again, our determination is to try and support good change and to make it happen and people like David Flory, again, have been working really hard on configuration issues with the Secretary of State and, getting the arguments across. And we'll have more of that, won't we, as time goes on. And finally, there'll be aggressive things for people to deliver this year, but we also need progress on the early part of change in long-term condition care, on urgent care, that we know will bear fruit later. We need to be doing the early work and paying rigorous project management attention to the delivery of the early milestones on those programs. If we don't do that, then the cost curves show that we run out of space somewhere between the beginning of next year and the beginning of the year after. Those cost curves are pretty tight anyway, so we need continued focus on making that stuff happen against this difficult background of change. Let me just finish by sort of making a bit of a kind of call to action. I mean, it's tough stuff, is this. It's difficult and challenging, and will kind of stretch all our efforts. I'm sure it is doing that now. It certainly is for me. But in one sense, I think we should see it as a good thing. It's absolutely clear, across Western countries, healthcare is consuming GDP, about 1.5% more of GDP. It's growing about 1.5% faster each year than the GDP of its host countries is. That's an unsustainable position. You can't consume 100%. You probably can't consume 30 or 40% of a nation's wealth in its healthcare system. And so there has to be, if we want to protect a universal healthcare system in this country, we have to begin to, and we want to do that quality, we have to begin to change the relationship between cost and quality. And so whilst the immersion in QIPP is a pretty difficult, robust and aggressive process, I think we should see it as building a platform for creating a sustainable system in which we use redesign, we use technology to constantly be improving the relationship between the quality of healthcare and its cost, and therefore be able to hand over, act as good stewards of the NHS for those who will run it after. So thank you so much for your time. I can see there's been plenty of activity on the question front, and I'm really happy now with Chris to pick up any of those issues that you've got.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Right, onto the questions, and we've got quite a few coming in. I feel like I'm commentating on a horse race here. Let's start with a couple from D. Harris Ugmabaha, and apologies if I've pronounced that name wrong. What's been done around audit and mapping of care pathways to support managing the workforce configuration?
If I understand the question correctly, I'm sorry, it's quite difficult sometimes checking that you've understood. I'm slightly repeating myself. We rather expected to be able to find well documented, well audited examples of when you move from a diabetes service that's hospital based to one that's community based, what that means in the movement of staff and cost between the two. In fact, we've really struggled to find that both in the evidence base in England and in this country, which is why what we're now doing is we've got the Centre for Workforce Intelligence working through in forensic detail a number of those models so that we can, A, use it to sort of exemplify and illustrate what we think the cost and staffing changes are, and for people to use as a starting place for calculations in their own area. So I'm really happy if people have got great examples, but we've struggled to find them. It's definitely a weakness in our knowledge base, and I suspect it's because of the organisational boundary. If you're running a hospital, then most people aren't that interested as they change services in what's picked up. As you're running a new community services, you often haven't got sight of what's in the community, and because both sides were growing over the last decade, there wasn't a need to work out the kind of gross net change between the different service models. Both sides were on a rising tide, but it's left us quite poorly underpowered in terms of being able to answer the question, if we change care for heart failure patients in this way, what will be created in different places and where do costs need to move. Doing the work now, but it would have been nice to have it earlier.
I think one of the issues also for me, because we're going through a lot of change, with our PFI scheme and transferring stuff out to the community. We've been using map medicine, been doing a lot of focus work with GPs and consultants, looking at what the care pathway should be, and then arising out of that comes your workforce changes. But it's very labour intensive, I have to say, because it has to be done almost at that individual disease specific level. On to another one now from Rob Clark. NHSP is able to reduce employment costs for trusts and PCTs on average by 7 to 8%. How can we get this message across? Well, I've maybe just done it for you.
Rob. Fantastic, Rob. Thank you. Well done. I'll answer a couple of ways. One of which is cynical, and therefore you should ignore, and the other one is deeply supportive of what you just said. I mean, my working life consists of me receiving 30 emails a day saying we've solved the problem. It seems to me that I've got so many that I could solve this problem 50 times over. And interestingly, laughing aside, the real issue is adoption, being discriminating about which of these ideas to back, and then how you make that happen at scale. So even organisations like NHS professionals feel, why don't people want our help in releasing cost? Now, so we want to act as a channel for some of that, and hence the reason for doing things like the call today. But it is interesting that still many local leaders don't seem to find it easy or desirable to kind of access the information about what's out there and what to handle. On the specifics, all our of NHSP's type stuff, all of our analysis, unsurprisingly, shows that increasing staff productivity is the most significant contributor to QIPP delivery. That there remain huge opportunities to do that, and we're trying to invest heavily in the productive series as a tool to people to help. And within that, the use of temporary and agency staff is a classic QIPP issue, in that we often seem to have, I mean, the classic example of that is not in nursing actually, but in medical locums. In medical temporary staffing cover, we have, in most cases, the inverse of QIPP. We have the poorest quality doctors who are also the most expensive. And we seem to be somehow enthralled to some of these agencies in terms of what's going on. We looked at some great work Scotland were doing to actually ban some really, really poor practices, both in their NHS and in the provider industry there, and we're looking to replicate those. But effective management of temporary staffing is one of the best ways to sustain frontline staffing that we already have and deliver more efficiency. And I've seen some of the work that NHSP have done, and it definitely is one of the major potential routes to support people in making that happen.
Okay, thank you. There's a message really, which is, again, we're doing a lot of adverts for organisations today. This is from MedMosaic. They're working with Birmingham Children's Hospital, and they're actually developing a map, the pathways and staff across healthcare settings, which, Russell, who submitted that message, you may like to contact HSMA to see if there's an opportunity for demonstrating some of the benefits of that to the wider audience. Care pathways is coming up more and more on the questions this afternoon. And another one about care pathways. Have we considered care pathway-based commissioning? And is that a place we ought to be going? And that's from Tom Mulhern.
Tom, yeah, thanks for that. Well, yes, I tried to hint at it in the presentation, which is that we think that we should be evolving the tariff system to much more pay for overall care of people rather than episodic elements of it. There are some good models of that internationally, where people have everything ranging from kind of capitation-based models, i.e. look after all 10,000 people with diabetes in this city to certain standards for this return. You make money if you manage their health well, you lose it if you don't, and you keep admitting them to hospital, through to much more targeted models where people have pathway contracts and pathway pricing. And so, yeah, we are wanting to take forward that work on enhancing the tariff and commissioning system to be buying those sorts of models. As I said, calibrating those at a national level in terms of price isn't a simple thing. Some of the data is relatively weak. particularly the out-of-hospital elements. And there's a risk of there being clearly different models required in urban centres to, say, very rural patches. And so some caution is needed on the extent to which you put in place a single commissioning construct nationally and a single price, or whether you need to create a framework which people can modify for their particular circumstances. But we're really interested in working with people on how we develop a tariff system in exactly that way.
Another one of the themes running through is around change, and the question is there a real need for change management and change in the current culture? And the question is, how is the process seeking to address this difficulty? I guess perhaps a process system perhaps is seeking to address this difficulty.
Yeah.
What are the national tools that can help?
Yeah. So I think, do we need focus on change? Yes. But it's not, for me, it's not quite enough just to say that. And I think we need to be clear what our sort of change model is. And I think we have sort of two outdated change models in the NHS. One is the centre will tell me what to do and beat me to death if I don't do it. And the other one is leave me to get on by myself. And those are both, I think, quite, they maybe served a purpose, but they're quite immature. I've certainly operated them, but I think they're quite immature. The change model that we think needs to happen is a hybrid of the best we have in terms of performance management, i.e. good measurement, accountability, discipline, with the best we've learned from improvement, i.e. engagement of people, proper clinical redesign of services. Sometimes in our history, the performance management stuff tends to not bother with engaging people or properly redesigning. And sometimes in history, the improvement stuff doesn't have enough delivery discipline. It's not clear who's in charge. The measurements are weak and so on. And I think what we're trying to create is a strong project managed focus, discipline, performance discipline on quality improvement processes. That's what we've been encouraging SHAs and PCTs to think about doing. As you're hinting at, there are some skills issues there. And we're looking specifically with nationally at the leadership budgets we have, to make sure that we're supporting with investment in people's skills to make that happen. There are all sorts of speculations about where that should be spent, but often the view is that it's in the middle of organisations. It's in the people running departments where all this comes together and where there is maybe a need for some particular development support on developing that change management toolkit.
I mean, I think in the next two webinars we're going to address some of those issues, particularly around perhaps the staff engagement, because that's about, for me, creating a culture of change. Jim, can I thank you for your presentation and answering the questions this afternoon. Also need to thank HFMA for organising it and Liaison for sponsoring it, and especially those who've tuned in and stayed with us. A reminder that this event will be available online from Monday in both glorious mono, no doubt, and the slides as well. Can I just signal the next two webinars? The first one is engaging staff in delivering sustained performance improvement, and I think that's the message that's come up several times this afternoon. That's on the 6th of April with Jane Tompkinson, who's Deputy Chief Executive and Director of Finance for the Countess of Chester. And then the third one of the trilogy is on the 12th of May, Quality and Safety in a Cold Climate, by Bernard Crump, Chief Executive of the NHS Institute for Innovation and Improvement. So can I just thank everybody again for